I think we're okay to start. Let the stragglers come in and find us where they may, kind of thing. I'd like to start by introducing myself and welcoming you here. My name's Anthony Marco. I'm the president of the Hamilton District Labour Council here in Hamilton. I feel like I should be leaning forward like this. Welcome. Thank you for coming. This is one of those opportunities the Labour Council doesn't get the chance to do too often, but we are happy to do it because one of the standing committees that we have on Labour Council is a Human Rights and Peace Committee. And one of the things that they look for is opportunities whereby we can not only educate some of our own members on issues, but we can help to bring together members of our own and members of the public to kind of hear different opinions, learn about some of the stands that people have on things, and try to integrate those things not only into a world view, but into some of the concerns that we already have. In other words, people who are concerned with labor issues all the time, you don't live in a vacuum. Nobody lives in a vacuum. It's good to hear what is happening around the world. It's good to hear how you can integrate some of the world view with what's going on with your own. In a minute, I'm going to introduce our speaker for the evening. After the speaker, we are going to take some questions. I will be the first to admit, and you will probably know as well, that we are not here to work on a long-form building of consensus, although I'm sure as an ambassador, our guest tonight has probably had to do that on many occasions. We are here to listen to what he has to say. If you have questions, it's a learning opportunity. I'm not expecting that there may not be at the end some hard questions and people who disagree. That's fine. We're here to be respectful, and although I'm not going to read it out for you, I would want to remind the people in the room that are Labour Council that we hold all Labour Council meetings to a anti-harassment and bullying clause, and we hope that we will not have to accuse anybody of such things. It's okay to disagree. Trust me, at Labour Council, we disagree all the time on things, as some of the veterans there can tell you. The last thing I want to talk about, he just walked in the room. I want to thank the Human Rights and Peace Committee. The chair, Dave Rennie, just walked in. Dave, I don't know if you want to just raise your hand. Thanks, Dave. The other thing I want to mention, if you're unfamiliar with Labour Council in Hamilton, I know some of you might be, we represent 40,000 unionized workers across the Hamilton area. Our meetings are open to the public. You are welcome to come. We are currently taking a break for a couple of months for the summer, but we start up again in September, usually the third Thursday of the month. If you go to hamiltonlabour.ca, you can find all the information there. And I can tell you one of the things that we're really going to be working on this summer is to try and move the city of Hamilton towards being a living wage employer.
Hear, hear.
We think that that's an important step. We might not get every person in the city to buy into that yet. We're working on it. But if we can just get the city of Hamilton itself to start paying their employees a living wage 100% across the board, and they're doing a pretty good job of it, if we can get them to do it with everybody, that's a great first step. And a good step in help moving our city towards all making a living wage as well, so we can help start to move some of the people in Hamilton out of poverty to a better place. So I have the honor of giving an introduction tonight, and admittedly, you probably aren't used to seeing this. You're probably used to seeing people up here with file folders and notes. I read off of my phone. So if that seems strange to some of you, I would just say probably get used to it, because you're going to probably see it more and more often. James Bissett joined the Canadian government in 1956. He spent the next 36 years as a public servant in the Departments of Citizenship and Immigration and Foreign Affairs. In 1974, he was appointed head of Immigration and Foreign Services. During the 1970s, he served at the Canadian High Commission in London, England. In 1980, he became the Assistant Under-Secretary of State for Social Affairs in the Department of External Affairs. 2 years later, he was appointed the Canadian High Commissioner to Trinidad and Tobago, where he remained until 1985. He was then seconded to the Department of Employment and Immigration as Executive Director to help steer new immigration and refugee legislation through the Parliament of Canada. In 1990, he was then appointed Canadian Ambassador to Yugoslavia, Bulgaria, and Albania. In the summer of 1992, he was recalled from there and retired from Foreign Service to accept a job as the head of the International Organization for Migration in Moscow, helping the Russian government establish a new immigration agency and implementing settlement programs for Russians returning to Russia from other parts of the former Soviet Union. It's my pleasure tonight to introduce our speaker, James Bissett.
Thank you very much, Anthony. I'd like to also express my appreciation to the Labour Council of Hamilton for inviting me here. What I'll say tonight is going to be controversial, and I hope I won't be seen to be a bully, but I am going to speak pretty frankly about something that's happening in Ukraine that I think more people should know about and pay attention to, because it's tragic what's happening there. As I speak, people are being killed. There's still artillery fire going on both sides. There's a precarious ceasefire, but I'm not optimistic that it will hold. Why I'm speaking out as a diplomat is when you're a diplomat you can't speak out as frankly as you might wish. I'm no longer a diplomat, so I can tell the truth. And I was a witness. What's happening in Ukraine, I was a first-hand witness to see it happen before. It happened in Yugoslavia. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that. Yugoslavia was broken up. Terrible civil war took place there. Well over 100,000 people killed. The country was pretty well destroyed. There's still problems there that probably will take a very long time to resolve. It's happened in other countries, and we've witnessed it. It's happened in Egypt. It's happened in Libya. It's happened in Iraq. It's happened in many of the countries of South America, Central and South America, Guatemala, El Salvador. You can go down the list. And all of those countries that I mentioned have gone through a terrible ordeal quite unnecessarily. And now we've got Ukraine. The problem with Ukraine is that it'll touch all of our lives. I mean, we've got the civil war going on in Ukraine is a proxy war between the United States and Russia. And both of them are armed heavily with nuclear weapons. If I remind you, the Americans unilaterally withdrew from the anti-ballistic missile treaty, and that has led to a proliferation of more nuclear weapons. And an accident could trigger it off. We celebrated the 100th anniversary of the First World War in this June, this month. A year ago, 1915, a lot of young men were being killed in Europe, fighting again an unnecessary war that suddenly happened because someone was shot in a remote city in Bosnia called Sarajevo. 2 or 3 weeks later, there were hundreds of thousands of young Frenchmen and Germans being killed. And that could happen again because we haven't learned our lessons. And I'll have something to say about that. But first of all of those countries I mentioned that were devastated by civil war and so on, it was not Vladimir Putin's fault. And what's happening in Ukraine today is not the fault of Vladimir Putin. The fault lies with the United States of America. And they are the ones that caused the problems in today's Ukraine. They have been desperately trying to get Ukraine on the Western European orbit and to separate and break away from Russia. And that's been going on for a long time. And it was called the Orange Revolution. And it was the same tactics that were used in Yugoslavia, that were used in Georgia, that were used in quite a number of other countries. American non-governmental organizations financed with millions of dollars from George Soros and from the State Department and the CIA move into a country that's somewhat unstable, but that has ethnic problems, and begin to have articles written in the major newspapers, people appearing on television, well-paid locals who are getting US dollars for the first time, and they build up a scenario and a narrative that leads to demonstrations in the street, riots, and eventually, usually the demonization of the current leader, whether it's Milosevic, whether it's Putin, whether it's Gaddafi or Saddam Hussein. The same pattern develops. And then there's bloodshed and killing and a dreadful mess. And I blame the United States for this because I saw it happen in Yugoslavia. Yugoslavia was a prosperous country. It had ethnic religious problems that had been pretty well resolved, but and it was an important country to the United States during the Cold War. And Tito got a lot of assistance and money from the United States because he was in the middle, so to speak, and played a useful role. But when the collapse of the Soviet Union took place, Yugoslavia was no longer important. Not only that, it was socialist. Almost all of the business was run by the government, and it wasn't playing patsy with the United States. So both the Germans and the United States decided to break it up, and they did it by exploiting ethnic religious problems. The Croatians were Catholic, had been part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. The Serbs were Orthodox, leaning more towards Russia, and the Muslims in Bosnia were Muslims in Bosnia. And it was a good formula for the Americans, and particularly the Germans at the beginning, to give armed assistance and help and money to the Croats to bring back an extreme right-wing group called the Ustashi, who had played a prominent role in the Holocaust in the Second World War, slaughtering Serbs and Roma people and Jews. And when Tudjman, that I met many times, came back with the checkered symbols of the former Ustashi, he got a lot of support from the United States and primarily from Germany. Eventually there was a civil war, you know about it. But who was blamed for that civil war? Milosevic was. He was a Serbian president. He was an old communist. He wasn't interested in Greater Serbia. He was an apparatchik who was interested in personal prestige, power, and privilege. And he didn't really give a damn about Serbia. And he betrayed the Serbs in Bosnia, and he betrayed the Serbs in Croatia. But when he was useful to the United States, and Madeleine Albright was at one point nominating to be Time magazine's Man of the Year, when he became of no use to them after Yugoslavia had broken up, they ditched him and demonized him and called him the Witcher of the Balkans, and then set him up for a bombing of Serbia that took place for 78 days and nights. A country that had threatened no one, was not a problem with its neighbors, did not possess nuclear weapons, and Canada unfortunately participated in that bombing. And this has gone on in many other countries. And because I was there and I saw what was happening, I decided to speak out during the bombing. And I went from coast to coast, speaking out against the bombing and trying to convince Canadians that this was a propaganda campaign engineered by the Western media to demonize Serbia and to support the wrong people. Just as an example, I won't go on too long about Yugoslavia, but after the Croatians had seceded violently from Yugoslavia, then Izetbegovic, who was the Muslim leader in Bosnia, whom I met many, many times, an interesting history. His first role as a young man was recruiting Muslims in Bosnia for the Waffen-SS division, the Hanzar division. He was later imprisoned by Tito for extreme Islamic views. He had written a book in which he said basically that Muslim institutions cannot live alongside of others and that they must dominate. He had a referendum in Bosnia, remember this, to separate, but he didn't get the 60% required, and so the referendum failed. On the basis of that, the European Union called Izetbegovic, Karadzic, the Serbian leader, and the Croatian leader to Lisbon in June of 1992, and they signed an agreement that if Bosnia did separate, eventually legally, and in accordance with the law, then there'd be 3 communal groups based on the religion: Muslim, Christian, Serbs, Catholic, Croats. Izetbegovic signed that document. When my neighbor, who lived across the street from me, Warren Zimmerman, the U.S. ambassador, heard that news, he flew to Sarajevo and said to Izetbegovic, "Why did you sign this silly agreement?" And Izetbegovic said, "Well, we lost the referendum, and I didn't have any choice." And Zimmerman said, "Just announce unilateral independence, and we, the Americans, will support you." Izetbegovic said, "That will cause a civil war here. There's no way that the Christian Serbs are going to live under Muslim rule. They did so for 600 years, and they will fight because they're Serbs." Zimmerman said, if they fight and there's a war, we will support you militarily. And they did. And it cost 100,000 lives. And the Americans supported Izetbegovic. This is on the record. They made a deal with, guess who? Khomeini in Iran, who have imported into Bosnia 10 to 15,000 mujahideen fighters, veterans of the Afghan wars. They also refused to allow NATO flights over Bosnia at night. And at night, they flew over Bosnia and provided at Tuzla, the Muslim capital, all the armament, modern equipment that enabled the Muslims to fight the Serbs. Now, subsequently, they did the same thing with Kosovo. They armed and trained the KLA, which was a terrorist organization, sent them back into Kosovo, Albanians, to shoot and kill Serbian mayors, Serbian police, knowing that Milosevic would have to retaliate, which he did, and sometimes pretty ruthlessly. But that led to the bombing of Serbia for 78 days and nights. To settle it, because the German civilians were beginning to get nervous about the bombing going on, and beginning to put pressure on their own government, saying, what are we doing bombing these people for 78 days? We know what bombing is all about. So, in desperation, they got the former Russian Prime Minister, Chernomyrdin, and the former UN man, Sakari, the Finn, and went to see Milosevic and said, what can we do to stop this bombing? And he said, just stop it. And let the UN decide what should be done. And so the bombing stopped, and the UN did decide. The UN decided that Kosovo should remain Serbian. Resolution 1244, you can look it up. And that all the refugees should be allowed back, and that the KLA should be disarmed, and that an international peace force should be brought into Kosovo. None of those provisions were followed. The Americans simply ignored them. They got NATO troops in. The first thing they did in Kosovo was build the largest military camp the Americans have had since the Vietnam War, Camp Bonspiel. And they still have it there. They didn't allow the Serbs back into Kosovo. And who protested? Putin protested. Putin said, this is wrong what you're doing. They ignored him. Later on, they asked Thaci, the Albanian leader in Kosovo, to declare unilateral independence. There was no referendum. Just declare it, they said. We'll recognize it. And they did. And Canada followed. And who objected and said, wait a minute, you can't do this? Putin. Putin said this is a violation of international law, violation of the United Nations Charter, and a violation of the Helsinki Final Accords. And you've opened a Pandora box if you do this. Every little country with a minority, ethnic minority, will start declaring independence. You can't do this. And basically they told Putin, mind your own business. And he said he would mind his own business, but he wouldn't forget it. And that he had some areas of the former Soviet Union with many Russians living in them that he might consider suggesting they declare independence, which eventually did happen. As you may know, in South Ossetia and Abkhazia. So I mean, with that kind of a background and seeing what's happened in Yugoslavia, I was devastated to see it again happening in Ukraine. And that's exactly what has happened. They began to agitate in Ukraine, spend lots of money buying Ukrainian journalists who were writing pro-Western articles, setting up NGOs in Ukraine, and started this so-called Orange Revolution. The endowment of Federation Endowment of Democracy, I forget the initials.
NED.
They get at least $100 million from the U.S. Congress to do this sort of thing. Soros spends millions of dollars doing it. Victoria Nuland, when the rioting started in the Maidan, in the square, and nobody knows how it started, but it appears to have started by just general discontent of Ukrainians who were living miserably, who had no hope for the future, and decided they had to do something about all of these corrupt governments that they'd had since they broke away from the Soviet Union. Those demonstrations were hijacked by the Americans. Because in the heights of the demonstrations on February the 20th, the Polish foreign minister and the German foreign minister sat down on both sides and they reached an agreement that the rioting should stop. There would be no retaliation for damage done during the rioting. The Prime Minister the President would stay on for a limited period of time, and then there would be free, internationally inspected elections. And in addition to that, the police would not get them involved in the demonstrations if any followed, and several other provisions. They all agreed. That was on February the 20th. February the 21st, rioting started. Nobody's clear of how or why, but the theory is, and this is, I think, probably authentic, that the Americans were very upset that the Europeans had reached this agreement and hired a bunch of thugs to come in and start rioting again, only this time they were armed and they started shooting, and 85 people were killed, including police. So the rioters, whoever was shooting, were shooting police as well as other rioters. And the following day, they stormed the legislative building, and Yanukovych, the president, fled for his life. And a new president was elected. And that president, I forget his name.
Yatsenyuk.
Yeah. Anyway, a week or so before that, there's a recording, a telephone recording intercepted between the Lithuanian minister who was on the ground on the Maidan and the U.S. ambassador in Kyiv, and Victoria Nuland, who was head of the U.S. State Department's European Division, who had visited Kyiv quite often during the rioting and was handing out cookies to the rioters, and who later admitted that the U.S. State Department had spent $5 million.
Billion.
Yes, in the previous 10 or 15 years, trying to convince Ukraine to separate away, to break away from the Russian orbit and join the Western camp. She, in her conversation, the ambassador said that the Europeans have got their candidate that they think should be the next president, and he was the former heavyweight boxing champion. But Victoria Nuland then said, F the European Union, we want Yat. And they got Yat. And the first thing that so-called parliament that came after the president fled to Moscow was to initiate legislation that would have outlawed the Russian language, that would have well, I forget all of the details, but it was provocative steps, but particularly outlawing the Russian and Greek language. And that caused the people in eastern Ukraine, of course, to object and to try and basically say that if you've got rid of this properly democratically elected president, whether he was corrupt or not, beside the point, all of the presidents have been corrupt, but he was democratically elected, and you've thrown him out by a coup d'etat organized by the Americans, and we don't like it. And that gave, as you know, Putin the chance to protect his national interests and say that there'll be a referendum in the Crimea, and the referendum was held, and 90% of the people wanted to return to Russia. On the Crimea, we keep hearing that Putin and the Russians invaded the Crimea, and that is absolute nonsense. They were already there. When it looked as though the Ukraine was going to break away from the Soviet Union, there was 2 referendums in the Crimea by the people. And over 90% of the people on both referendums said that if Ukraine breaks away from the Soviet Union, we will stay with Russia. We will return to Russia, because it's belonged to Russia since the 17th century. Since the Mongol invasions, it's part of Russia. And it was only a stroke of the pen by Khrushchev in 1954 that passed it on to Ukraine. Now the Americans and the British and the Canadians scream about the annexation of the Crimea. It was done, the referendum was fixed, it was illegal. It may have been illegal under international law, but if you remind Obama and Harper and the others that what happened in Bosnia in 1990, to what happened in Kosovo in 1999. And didn't you heed the warnings you were being given? So, I mean, the terms of reference of the lease that Russia had with Ukraine when Ukraine did break away from the Soviet Union was that the Black Sea ports and the naval supremacy of Russia on the Black Sea ports would remain under a lease. But in addition to that, and most people don't know that, the lease also entitled Russia to maintain 125,000 troops in Crimea. And so, you know, there was no need for Russia to invade Crimea. It was already occupied by large numbers of Russian troops. So, what I'm really getting at is, why is all of this happening? It isn't because the Americans have a great altruistic, powerful emotion to help the Ukrainian people. They couldn't care less. A Pew poll recently in the United States found that 80-some% of the people polled had no idea where Ukraine was. And, you know, our politicians don't seem to realize that there is Russia and Ukraine have had a historical, cultural relationship from the beginning of Russia. And it's a powerful reason for at least 15 million Ukrainians who are called pro-Russian rebels to be concerned about what's happening in Ukraine. After all, there was no offer of, let's sit down and discuss how we could meet some of your concerns about the Russian language, about having some autonomy. There was none of that. What happened was that some of these extreme right-wing militias started shelling and shooting people in eastern Ukraine. It wasn't the other way around, and they were defending themselves. And I mean, I don't know if Russia's troops are in Ukraine. The Ukrainian defense minister himself on public television announced that there were no regular Russian troops in Ukraine. He got chastised for it, but that doesn't say there are not Russian militias and Russian volunteers in Ukraine, or that Ukraine isn't getting equipment. But for God's sakes, what's happening on the other side? I mean, we're led to believe by all the media here that there's only two things going on in Ukraine, Russia and Ukraine. But the other major partner, the United States, is never mentioned. The New York Times has never admitted the events that I described to you about the coup d'etat that took place, Victoria Nuland's role in it, George Soros' role in it, the fact that the Americans have been pumping millions and billions of dollars into Ukraine to get this. You know, we don't hear that. We hear one kind of story. And that's what's alarmed me so much. I mean, we don't have honest journalism anymore. There is no one, none of the newspapers, the Citizen, the National Post, the Globe and Mail, will print anything about Ukraine that is factual. You will read between the lines. You know, it is alleged that Russian tanks were seen moving across the border. Reliable sources tell us that. But they never produce the evidence, because there isn't evidence. They never tell you, you know, they say that 300 people were killed in Donetsk from shelling, but they don't tell you who is doing the shelling. So you're left with the view, well, it could be the, you know, the so-called Russian rebel supporters. It's a dreadful situation, and it was totally unnecessary, and it leads all of us back into the Cold War. I don't know if you dare read the National Post, but if you had read it a week ago, a couple of weeks ago, or no, just a week ago, an editorial, a very strongly worded editorial, was saying that what NATO should do is to put heavy weapons, more missiles, more troops, NATO troops, and keep them in the Eastern European countries permanently. And this would be, and I'm quoting, an inexpensive way of solving the problem and boxing in Russia. Now, come on. How do they think Russia is going to react? They're not going to stand for it. Russia has been, will be a world power. That's what's upsetting the United States. They don't like it. But it's not Yeltsin they're dealing with now. And they're dealing with a Russia that's resurgent. And it's a Russia that we should respect. In 1989, Gorbachev offered Russia to join the European house, as he called it, and meet together. The Cold War is over. Let's get together. And to some degree, the Europeans responded to that. But there was one country that did not respond. That was the United States. After the Second World War, the Americans, the British, the Allies, the winners, were very generous towards Germany and Japan. They had the Marshall Plan. They brought it back as quickly as they could so that things could get back to normal. That did not happen when the Soviet Union collapsed and the Berlin Wall went down. The Americans did everything they could to weaken Russia, and have done it. And I don't know how long you want me to go on, but I want to tell you another bit of what happened in that critical period, 1989-1992. At the end of the Second World War, we must have all realized that we'd made a mess of the 20th century. We'd had two colossal world wars, World War I, World War II, millions killed, terrible destruction, human rights violations, slaughter, the Holocaust, and it ended by our dropping the atomic bomb on two Japanese cities. I mean, then we hadn't even got through the first half of the 20th century. At least the statesmen at the end of the Second World War realized that something had to be done, or with nuclear weapons, we weren't going to exist as a human race. We were going to kill ourselves off. So they created the United Nations and the Security Council. But at the basis of all of that was one simple little sentence. We must learn to resolve international disputes without violence. Can't we settle things without killing each other? That's the secret. And it's a very simple one. A very simple one. And it was carried over with NATO. People don't remember this, but I'm an old Cold War warrior. I lived through the Cold War. I was a diplomat during the Cold War. Canada played a role in the origins of NATO. It was our Foreign Minister, Louis Saint-Laurent, who encouraged the Europeans and the Americans that the European military alliance should cross over the Atlantic and become a North Atlantic alliance of Canada and the United States. That was a Canadian idea, and it was a good one. And Article 1 of the North Atlantic Treaty Alliance says, and I memorize it, I know it, that NATO will never use or threaten to use force in the resolution of international disputes and will always act in accordance with the United Nations Charter. That's Article 1 of the treaty. It's still there. Do you ever hear of it?
No.
What do you hear? You hear Article 5, that if somebody attacks Riga in Latvia, we're all involved. I mean, come on. Unfortunately, that may be true, because, you know, the Americans have parachutists and they're one of their top regiments doing military demonstrations in Riga. They have them in all of the Eastern European countries, and our own government is spending $500 million and sending our troops to train and teach Ukrainians how to behave as soldiers. And there's really a push on in the United States Congress of having heavy weapons sent there. Look, this is absolutely ridiculous. There is no reason for this to be happening in the beginning of the 21st century. And we've got to try and stop it. But who is interested? Nobody. Nobody's interested in foreign affairs anymore. You can't get the truth from the newspapers. George Kennan, who was the famous U.S. ambassador in Moscow for years during the Cold War, he said, I got it down, he wrote it in 1987 in the middle of the Cold War. He said, if the Soviet Union should sink tomorrow between the waters of the ocean, the Americans would have to recreate it almost immediately, because if not, within 2 weeks, the U.S. economy would collapse. Until his death several years ago at 94, he deplored the idea of any NATO expansion eastward. He said it will cause trouble. How do you think the Russians are going to react when NATO starts moving into countries that traditionally are Russia's enemies? It's going to cause a lot of trouble, and it'll cause a new Cold War. And he deplored it. And he said, part of the problem is we don't have any statesmen anymore. We have politicians, crass ones. They have no vision, they have no imagination. And I'm afraid he was right. Going back to Yugoslavia, in 1992, when the Soviet Union had collapsed and it looked as though we were, as some people said, it was the end of history. Now we'd have Pax Americana, we'd have peace, good order, and we could forget the possibility of a nuclear war. Everybody thought that was a great thing, but it didn't happen because the ideas of a lot of Americans, the Cold War never did end. And what they saw in 1992 was an opportunity to expand NATO. That if what was preventing them and what was the obstacle was Article 1. They didn't like Article 1 because it meant that all disputes would have to be resolved peacefully. So they found their opportunity in 1992 in Bosnia. They started bombing Serbian positions in Bosnia who were fighting the Muslims there. And that brought the fighting to an end because Clinton had ordered two things then. He'd ordered the Croats attack the remaining Serbs in Croatia and clean them out, and he said, do it in 5 days. And they did. In August 1995, almost all of the Serbs who had lived in Croatia for centuries were cleared out violently by Croatian armed American forces, and the first blows that were struck by American aircraft had knocked out all of the Serb anti-aircraft positions. In 1999, when the bombing of Serbia took place, it was done in violation of the UN Charter and in violation of NATO's Article 1. And nobody said anything about it. I mean, I complained about it. There were a few articles that were actually published, but nobody seemed to think there was anything wrong with that. And then on NATO's 50th birthday party, while the bombing was going on in March of 1999, Billy Clinton in Washington, at a big 50th NATO anniversary party, announced a new role for NATO. And the new role was that now NATO can intervene anywhere that it wants to intervene, whenever it wants to. And that was the new policy of NATO. Article 1 still is there, and this was a treaty. I would have thought that they would have to come back to the countries who had signed the treaty and asked for permission to recreate NATO and turn it on its head, so that it was now converted into an instrument, a military instrument of U.S. foreign policy. And it's acted that way since. Its history all through the 90s and all through this century has been one of duplicity, double standards, and hypocrisy. And it's going on again today. And if our own government has its way, we'll be sending more troops there and more money and maybe heavy weapons if we had any. I consider the decision by, first of all, we should never get involved in a civil war. I mean, that's a basic principle. Stay out of civil wars. Because once a civil war starts, everybody's a combatant, civilians and military. There's no distinction. So human rights go out the window. And we should never get involved in one, but we are involved in one now, primarily because there's 1.2 million Canadians who are ethnic Ukrainians. My wife is one of them. And the idea is that because they see the war as a war against Russia, they don't see U.S. involvement except they're helping Ukraine, they may well vote for her. Why did he stop off in Warsaw to meet the Warsaw politicians and sign a military agreement with Poland? Why? They're already parts of part of NATO. It's because there's at least 1 million Polish Canadians that may well vote for him. Why didn't he go to the heads of Commonwealth meeting in Sri Lanka? Because there's 300-some thousand Tamils in the GTA that might have voted against him if he had done so. Why didn't he allow the Russian delegation coming into an international conference here on anti-nuclear proliferation and refused to give them a visa to come here? Outrageous. Now, he says that when he shook Putin's hand, he said, get out of Crimea. I don't know whether the Russian media reported that or not, but we get that report, but I'm not sure it's true. How do we know it's true? We don't know what he said to Putin. But the United States can get away with this. We can all, our leaders can get away with this because nobody gives a damn. You know, people are Twittering and Facebooking and going through all this kind of revolution, as I said, Ken, a narcissistic sort of revolution that swept over the world, where we're doing Twittering and selfies. We're more interested in whether Justin Bieber got a traffic ticket or didn't. Nobody knows what's going on. It's partly because, of course, we're not getting the truth in Ukraine. We didn't get it in Yugoslavia. Milosevic was demonized. He was considered the butcher of the Balkans. All of the massacres were taking place by Serbs against Muslims or Croats. That was all nonsense. There were some horrific massacres of young Serb conscripts in Bosnia, beheaded by these Muslim mujahideen imported into Bosnia. Fierce massacres in Croatia by Croatians against Serbs. You know, Serbia, tiny little Serbia, who had more people killed in the First World War per capita than any other country, who was the first country to actually score victories on the Allied side in the First World War, and who fought fiercely in the Second World War against the Nazis, lost 1 million people, and suffered greatly. And we turn our backs on them and start bombing them? I mean, outrageous. But George Kennan, I think, not only did he say a lot of other wise things, but he said the U.S. military-industrial complex that President Eisenhower in his farewell address to the American people said was the greatest threat to peace in the world. He said it should now be the military-industrial media complex, because all of the Western media is controlled, and they feed us only what they want to. And they all say the same things, from the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Citizen, the Globe and Mail, the National Post, they're all on it. Democracy is threatened, freedom of speech is threatened, and that's why I've been speaking out. Just another thing, another great insult in my view was Canada not going to Moscow to celebrate the 70th anniversary of the end of the war.
Shame.
People forget this, and look, the American casualties in the First World War, fighting the Japanese and the Nazis, military casualties, were around 415,000. It was a lot. But Leningrad, one city in Russia, had 700,000 killed. 28 million. And we don't go to celebrate. 90-some% of the casualties inflicted on the Wehrmacht was inflicted by the Russians. And we don't pay that homage to them? Outrageous.
Shame.
Thank you.
In a minute we'll open it up for questions, and I'm going to repeat a couple things that I said off the top. I don't know for sure whether there is going to be dissent of opinions in the room. That's completely fine. As I said off the top, we are here to learn. We are here to ask questions. I'm going to ask, and those of you who have been to meetings like this before know how it can quickly devolve. I'm going to ask that we not try and enter in debate. This isn't a debate. If it was a debate, we would have several seats up here, and we would be actually having a debate. But ask questions. Ask pointed questions if you wish. Ask very straightforward questions if you wish. And I can tell you this from my experience in labor, if at all possible, try and keep the introductory speeches down to a minimum. Because sometimes I know we all want to give 5-minute speech before we get to our question, or we want to have a long speech and finish it with, don't you think? If we could avoid that to give as many people the opportunity to ask questions as possible, that would be great. Before I open up the floor, I didn't want to be remiss. I wanted to recognize in the back of the room the MP for Hamilton East Sunny Creek, Wayne Marsden, is here. So thanks for coming. And So what I hope to do is this. If you ask your question and it gets answered, we will only come back to people if everyone else has had a chance to ask. I hope that's the fairest way to do it. And so if we start, I see a few hands up. I will try and keep the order. So I see 4 hands up now. I will go to those 4 hands first, and then we'll kind of go from